Hi, this is Andrew Sears again, and in this lesson, I'm going to talk about the importance and challenges to having more diverse organization and ministry leadership. So, as I talked about in the introduction, I just want to cover this again. The term diversity and inclusion can be difficult for some evangelical Christians, often because it's been defined by secular audiences. It's been used by the far left to promote an everything's allowed approach to morality, which doesn't follow Christian teaching, and it's become a strong word with political connotations. And in elite secular universities, diversity and inclusion excludes evangelicals, and there's been this battle for worldview between elite secular academics and Christians, and much of the teaching on diversity incorporates assumptions of a secular worldview such as materialism. So recognize all that, and we still need to talk about diversity because it's really important. I'm going to talk about why it's important in organizations. So the reasons why it's important: one, there's a biblical mandate for it, and we're not going to get into the deep dive on that in this course. We do that in other courses, but ultimately, God is a God of justice, and there's a biblical mandate for justice. Secondly, there's just a practical reality of effectively serving clients and customers, especially if you're serving lower income communities and all your leadership looks different from the clients you're serving. That's not going to be an effective way to achieve your mission. There's huge changes in demographic trends. And this is also becoming more and more important to younger generations. I've talked to a lot of millennials, and they say, I'm not going to work for any of these organizations that don't have diversity because I'd just be ashamed to be a part of them. So recognizing that. So let me talk a little bit about what's happening in the U.S. So in the U.S., there are demographic trends where, going from 1960, where white folks were 85% of the country, it's going to 47% by 2050. Hispanic is going to be to 29%. Black is going to be at 13%. Asian at 9%. That's the current projections, but many of you are working in urban environments where this type of transition already happened, in your city, maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago. So it's already important, for your organization. Now, there's also just the global perspective. So Christianity used to be a Western religion, but if you look between, in 1800 until about 1970, it was still dominant Western, and then around 1970, the majority world, as people call it, non-Western countries now are by far the biggest majority of Christians. And if you look at the growth of Christianity, 99% of the growth of Christianity is happening outside the West. So globally, it's becoming more important. And by generation, so what this does is it looks at, okay, how important is it for Generation Z, the millennials, Generation X, and it doesn't show the boomers, but that's this last one here. And you can see that for millennials and Generation Z, racial equality is a lot more important. Gender equality is a lot more important. So all those reasons this is important for anyone in any organization, but especially if you're serving in, diverse communities or at-risk communities, or low-income communities, this is especially important. So now let's just talk about the reality of the world. So this is some data on nonprofit leadership. So what does nonprofit leadership look like? And this is leadership across the entire country in the United States, but this is going to be true in other countries, this type of bias. So 85% or 84%, 83.5% of nonprofit leadership's white. Whereas, if you're serving in poverty communities, white poverty in the U.S. makes up about 48%. And that's if you're in cities, it's even, typically less than that. Black leadership's about 10%. And there's this mismatch you can see between the leadership of nonprofits and the clients, especially for nonprofits that are serving lower income communities. So I think we can all agree that's not something we want, right? So we want to have more balance. Now, there's same type of issue for across gender. And one of the things that if you look at the data across gender, then and you take small nonprofits, actually there's a decent number of small nonprofits that are led by women. But as you go to the largest nonprofits, then you see a much lower percentage of those that are led by women. Now, part of what's interesting is the nonprofit sector overall, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's like 2/3 made of women. So, something's happening whenever you have at the lower ranks, it's, largely women, but then at the upper ranks it isn't. So I think we'd all agree that probably also, shouldn't be happening to that level. Now, then there's evangelical organizations versus all nonprofit. So in evangelical organizations, women hold 21% of board positions across all nonprofits. So evangelicals generally are doing worse compared to all nonprofits. They hold 43% of board positions. 16% are of CEOs versus 40% of CEOs, and 19% of if you look below CEOs of top paid leadership positions. So, and then, you can also look at this from an organizational perspective. So if you have a male-led nonprofit, the average budget's $2 million. If you have a female-led nonprofit, the average budget is between $500,000 and $1 million. So all this is just data. And the question is, what's happening? Why is this happening? I'm not doing this presentation to make, white men feel guilty. I'm a white male. What I'm doing is just to, I'm a data person, so I like to look at what is the truth, what is the reality. And I think one thing that's helpful to recognize, how is this happening? One thing that's helpful to do that is to look at another grid, but this one is a grid on the types of injustice. Now, this is similar to the systems grid that I showed you, but one of the axes is different. So the individual and collective over here on the left is the same as the systems grid, but the bottom part, and the left and right, I've changed from intentional and unintentional. So there's different types of injustice. There's individual unintentional injustice. So that would be, individual intentional injustice. And most people, whenever they think of racism, they're saying, I'm not a bigot, right? Just people being selfish, people bullying, having abusive management. So all those can be forms of individual intentional injustice. Then unintentional would be not understanding culture. It would be something that you do, you offend someone. You shake someone's hand in a way that they don't like. You violate their personal space. You say something that you didn't realize was culturally offensive. Not understanding someone's perspective. Unconscious bias. There's lots of studies that if you put out resumes with just different names, exactly the same name or same rest of the resume, then you get different rates of callbacks depending on what names you put in there, across both race and gender. And then there's unjust laws. So this would be individual, collective. Policies creating an unequal playing field, exploitation, unjust war, and countries imperialism and country to country injustice, right? And then unintentional might be cultural encroachment and assimilation. There's a friend of mine who he said he's an African-American man. He went to a small town in Canada and there wasn't a single black person within, he said, like 50 miles. And there's nothing that was intentional, but he couldn't get any of the things that he needed. And around him, it was just, difficult. And there's also, assimilation. There's second order effects. For example, urban decay, so an urban area might start to decline, and then you have white flight that happens. And then, the first tier is often the white flight. Then you have the black middle class flight. And then, that's what a second order effect is. And then you have natural momentum of systems, different access to social capital, and natural bias of funding models. So whenever we're talking about, how do these things happen? Well, it happens across all four of these quadrants. And most people assume injustice comes from quadrant 1, but the reality is I believe most injustice comes from quadrants 3 and 4. So let me just talk about an example of that. And, most of your organizations aren't going to change their funding model. If getting an organization to change its funding model is kind of the equivalent of getting a church to change its denomination, or a denomination to change its, core theology. It's just not likely to happen. But funding models of nonprofits have inherent biases into them. One of the statements that I said is that we're all fallen. Everything we do is fallen. In one way or another. It can be redeemed, but there's sin built into the world, and it's built into funding models. And a lot of organizations don't want to talk about the sin that's built into their funding models. So let's just talk about the development department or individual donor funding model. So most large nonprofits and ministries, this is the model that they're using. And the advantage is that most funding, if you get 100,000 donors that are regularly giving to you, then that's the most sustainable model for most nonprofits. So in terms of nonprofit strategy, this is the top strategy to have. Now, the challenge with that strategy is there's a tendency for leaders to be similar to major donors, so white, male, middle class, and above. And so you end up having a culture of the funders that's different from those being served, which often leads to the culture of the leaders being different. Now, there's some individual donor models like sponsorships and things like that work a little bit better, and there's ways to offset this. Often, blending funding models can be helpful. Now, another funding model is personal fundraising, or the missionary model. So InterVarsity, Cru, missionaries. Of parachurch organizations, this is one of the top for the really large organizations. So if you want to become really large, there's really two ways to do that: through sponsorships or through individual fundraising. So, sponsorships is more in this top domain, and that would be what World Vision and Compassion International use. But the other one would be where individuals raise money for themselves. And the big advantage is highly scalable. Now, it has the same downside as the other one. Now, honestly, it has a little bit less gender bias, I would say, but it has, in some ways, even a stronger class bias, because it's going to have a tendency for leaders to be white and middle class or above, and ultimately, to do this, for this funding model to work with you, you have to have high access to social capital. Then the third funding model is social enterprise and earned income. So an example of that would be thrift stores. And City Vision University is following this, this model. So with City Vision University and thrift stores, we actually used to follow a model. Well, I'll talk about that a little bit later, but one of the big advantages of this model is the culture of the organization's likely to be closer to the culture of those you're serving. Now, the challenge of that model is, City Vision can't serve those who can't pay unless they have access to, say, like a Pell Grant or something like that. So, with, say, rescue missions, they can serve, the homeless, and they're not expecting the homeless to pay them rent. So that's an advantage of that model. And a lot of the organizations that have sponsorships is the same thing, to serve the poorest of the poor. Now, a lot of, I could put other Christian universities in here, but they have, the bias associated with them is that their business model distorts them to have to serve upper middle class folks, and that's something that City Vision's chosen, not to do. Where we want to serve the poor, we want to serve the middle class, we want to serve, we don't serve the rich very well in what we're doing. So there's a social enterprise earned income model. Then there's a government funding model. So World Vision gets government funding. Salvation Army, the parent organization of City Vision Tech Mission, used to get government funding, and one big advantage of that is you can often have improved organizational diversity. So whenever we ran an AmeriCorps program, we had As I mentioned, the highest percentage of Black and Latino-led organizations as our partners, and Black and Latino AmeriCorps members, because they didn't have to go raise their own money, right? So there's an advantage to that. Now, the disadvantage is the government's a secularizing force, and in the past 10 years, it became increasingly difficult for Bible-based organizations like City Vision and Tech Mission to get government grants without compromising our values. And we also ran into some pretty big challenges with them and around social class also in their model. And then the last model is the church tithe model. Everyone's familiar with that. All churches. And the advantage of this is that the culture of those giving is the same as the culture of those being served. So, that it's works well for ethnic churches, Black church, Latino church. There's not a bias in that's going to distort the leadership to be white, but there is a larger bias in society. So if you're going to serve a lower income community, then you're likely to have a more limited budget, and that becomes a challenge. So what happens is you have this bias, and that creates a bias in leadership. So with the funding model, what happens is, if you look at where donations go and you look at who are the funders, right? So foundation presidents, and I could do a gender analysis. I don't know that I have the data entirely available, but you have foundation president, so 94% white. Foundation board members, 86% white. So what is happening is the nonprofit leadership is looking more like the funders, because honestly, that's the way to optimize your revenue. The more you look like the funders, the more there's going to be less, cultural distance for you. So, so foundation funding ends up going 97% to white nonprofits, and then you have this, white-led nonprofits, and then you have total poverty. That's 52% people of color, and you have this bias that happens. So how does all that happen? Well, the most effective fundraising typically matches the culture and demographics of those that you're fundraising from. And most organizations, the more senior you go, the more you're going to be involved in fundraising. So for an organization to be financially sustainable, the leadership must excel at revenue generation. And then you have, as I talked about before, you have this law of the lid across race and class and gender, and it limits the ability of leaders to raise up those that are different from them. So without intentional effort, the systemic bias becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. So part of what we have to do is we have to be intentional. So, so you say the world is, sinful. Does that mean that we all just throw in the towel and we just give up and we say, okay, the devil's going to win? That's not what we do. What we do is we have to have intentional strategies, not just individually for our own personal development. We have to have intentional strategies for our organizations. So hopefully that's helpful. If you have questions, again, ask your instructor.